No maid had ever survived a full week inside the Falcone estate, and most didn't even make it past the third night before they ran. So when Maddie Brennan dragged her broken-wheeled suitcase up that long marble driveway, 27 years old, soft around the edges in a way the world had taught her to apologize for, with tired brown eyes and a stubborn kind of warmth that no amount of bad luck had managed to kill, the old housekeeper just shook his head and muttered that she wouldn't last either. She needed the money too badly to care. Her mother's hospital bills had buried her. Her little brother's heavy tuition fees were entirely on her shoulders, and this job paid more than it had any right to. Nobody bothered to tell her why. They didn't mention that her employer, Salem Falcone, 37, was the most feared man in Southside Chicago, the kind of man whose name made grown men go quiet, a man so cold and so alone at the top of his empire that he'd stopped expecting anyone to stay. They didn't mention the locked room at the end of the hall, the one she was never supposed to enter, and they definitely didn't tell her that on her very first night, she'd hear something behind that door that would force her to choose between following his rules and saving his life. If you're enjoying this so far, do me a favor and tap that like button, share this with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's head back to that long marble driveway, the night Maddie Brennan walked through a door that 9 people before her had run from. The heavy oak door closed behind Maddie with a deep, muffled echo, and the outside world vanished at once, as if it had never existed at all. Frank Delgado, the butler with silver hair and shoulders weighed down by something heavier than age, led her through a foyer so vast that the sound of her shoes striking the marble floor seemed like someone else's footsteps. Everything here was expensive and cold. The dark paneled walls, the oil paintings hanging in gilded frames without a single smiling face among them, and an enormous crystal chandelier spilling down from the high ceiling. Bright but not warm, the kind of light that made a person feel watched rather than welcomed. The air carried the faint scent of wood polish, lilies that had gone just a little too ripe in a porcelain vase, and beneath it all, something very faint and metallic that she couldn't name, and decided not to try. Frank stopped in front of a long table, set down a thick stack of contracts, then pushed it toward her along with a pen. "I already signed," Maddie said softly, but he only tapped one finger on the last page, where 3 additional lines had been printed in bold. "Read it again," he said, his voice not irritated, only tired. She bent over and read. "No questions, no telling, and never, under any circumstances, enter the room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway." Maddie looked up, one eyebrow raised. "I understand the no questions and no telling part, but this forbidden room sounds like one of those ghost stories people use to scare children. What's in there? A monster?" Frank didn't smile. He only looked at her for a long while, his eyes seeming to weigh how much was just enough to say. "The less curious you are," he answered, "the longer you'll live." The sentence should have made her shiver, and it did, but Maddie had learned long ago that the only way not to crumble in the face of fear was to turn it into a joke before it could turn her into prey, so she only shrugged and took the pen, scrawling her name beside that frightening line, then said that at least people here were decent enough to warn her ahead of time, because her old company hadn't even bothered to tell her the coffee machine had faulty wiring. One corner of Frank's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but closer to one than anything she had seen from him since she stepped through the gate. He led her down another hallway, this time toward the back of the mansion, where the ceiling was lower and the yellow light was warmer. And for the first time since setting foot in this place, Maddie heard a sound that belonged to human life, the clatter of pots and pans, and the voice of someone humming an old melody. The kitchen appeared, wide and bright, steam rising from a pot of simmering broth, and standing in the middle of it all was a woman of about 60, wearing an apron speckled with flour and eyes that were sharp but kind. "Greta," Frank introduced her curtly, then left as if he had finished the hardest part of his day. The woman looked Maddie up and down, not with the cold judgment Maddie had grown used to in the front hall, but with the gaze of someone deciding she was going to take care of somebody. "This one is thinner than the ones before," Greta said, though that clearly wasn't true and they both knew it. Then she pushed a plate of hot buttered bread toward her. "Eat. In this house, my food is the only thing that isn't trying to kill you." Maddie burst out laughing, a real laugh that escaped before she could hold it back, and she realized that in this cold, frightening house, she had found at least one human being she could endure. She took a bite of bread, so delicious it almost made her forget the unease twisting in her stomach, then asked in a deliberately light voice what their employer was really like and whether he was truly as terrifying as everyone made him seem. Greta stopped stirring the pot. For a moment, the steam blurred her face. "Just do your work," she said quietly. "Don't look into his eyes too long, and never let him see that you pity him." Maddie meant to ask why, but there was something in the silence that followed that made her swallow the question along with the last bite of bread. Greta had barely cleared the plate away when a young man named Toby poked his head into the kitchen and said the boss wanted to see the new girl right now, and the way his voice dropped on the words "right now" was enough for Maddie to understand that this wasn't an invitation. She followed him up the grand staircase toward the east wing, where each step seemed to swallow a little more light, until they stopped before a set of double doors. Toby knocked 3 times, then immediately withdrew as if he didn't want to be anywhere near it when the door opened. Inside was a large study with an entire glass wall overlooking Chicago at night. The city spread out below like a sea of cold lights, and standing with his back to her, one hand resting on the back of a chair, was Salem Falcone. He didn't turn around right away. He let her stand there long enough for the silence itself to become a declaration of who truly held power in this room, and when he finally turned, Maddie understood why people lowered their voices when they spoke his name. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, and his gray eyes moved over her from head to toe, slowly, openly, in the way someone might inspect an item that had been delivered by mistake. "They sent me this," he said, his voice low and even, without a trace of warmth. "Someone who couldn't run 2 steps if trouble came, and who looks as if she'd surrender before she made it up a single flight of stairs." The remark was designed to hurt, and it struck exactly where it was meant to, a hot flush rising up Maddie's neck. But she'd heard enough words like that in her life to know silence only let them sink deeper. "So the boss hires people to clean and scrub, not to run cross-country," she replied, her voice so steady it surprised even her. "And the last time I checked, a broom doesn't care how many pounds the person holding it weighs." A numb moment followed, the kind of moment when she could almost hear the blood pounding in her ears, because no one, absolutely no one, spoke to this man that way. Salem looked at her longer, differently this time, no longer with the passing glance one gave an object, but with the stare of a man who had just discovered that object knew how to bite. As he took one step toward the desk, he briefly placed a hand against his left ribs, a gesture so small and quick it was almost invisible. Then his jaw tightened for 1 second before his face returned to stillness, and Maddie, with eyes long accustomed to recognizing pain in people, determined to hide it, noticed the detail and said nothing. "The ones before you all thought they were clever," he said. "They lasted an average of 4 days. Do you think a sharp tongue will keep you here any longer?" "No," Maddie answered. "My strong back will keep me here. The tongue is just to keep me from going insane." Something passed through his eyes, too fast to be called amusement, but enough that he didn't dismiss her at once. 1 week, he said at last, each word falling like a sentence. "You have 1 week. If you irritate me, if you ask a question I don't want to hear, if you step into a place where you're not allowed, you'll be out of those gates before sunrise. Clear?" "Clear," she said, and turned to leave. But inside her was a battle her face didn't reveal. One half of her wanted to throw the contract in his face and walk out with the last scrap of her pride intact, while the other half, the half thinking about the numbers on the bills she no longer dared to open, knew pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She stopped at the threshold without turning back. "You know something, sir," she said softly. "I've met plenty of people far more frightening than you, and most of them were frightening because they were truly powerful, not because they stood with their backs to a window trying to look the part." Then she stepped out, closed the door behind her, and only when she had reached the dark hallway and leaned her back against the cold wall did she allow her hand to tremble, just once, before drawing in a deep breath and going to find her way back to her room. Maddie's room was on the 3rd floor, in the east wing, not far from the hallway that led to the room she had sworn in black and white never to enter, and perhaps because she had sworn it, sleep kept drifting in and out without ever fully coming. Then, sometime well past midnight, when the entire mansion had sunk into the thick kind of silence that only belonged to houses far too large for the number of people living inside them, she heard it, a deep, dull sound from the end of the hall, not the wind, not the creak of an old house, but the sound of something heavy collapsing onto the floor. Maddie sat straight up, her heart pounding, and she had meant to pull the blanket over her head and pretend she hadn't heard anything, because every survival instinct in her was screaming that people paid her a high salary precisely so she wouldn't hear sounds like this. But then a second sound reached her, softer this time, a stifled groan from someone trying not to cry out. And the human part of her, the part years of hardship still hadn't managed to kill, pushed her out of bed before reason could stop her. She walked barefoot down the cold hallway, stopped in front of the forbidden door, and set her hand on the knob. For 1 second, she could hear Frank's warning as clearly as the bold printed line in the contract, and then she pushed the door open. Inside, beneath the yellow glow of a desk lamp, Salem Falcone was collapsed on one knee beside the sofa. One hand braced against the floor, the other pressed hard to his left ribs, and between his fingers, blood was seeping out and staining the front of his white shirt black. He lifted his head and looked at her, his gray eyes clouded now with pain, and the first thing he did wasn't ask for help, but grit out an order for her to get out. Yet his voice had lost all the authority it had carried that afternoon, leaving only the exhaustion of a wounded animal still trying to preserve its pride. Maddie didn't leave. She knelt beside him, pushed his hand aside to look, and when she lifted the edge of his shirt, she saw a long tear along his side. Not the cut of a kitchen knife, not the mark of a fall, but the kind of wound she knew exactly how to handle, thanks to her extensive advanced training in trauma care before life forced her to walk away. "Call the hospital," she said, already pulling out her phone, but his blood-covered hand caught her wrist with a strength that was startling in his condition. "No hospital," he hissed through his teeth. "No one knows. You call emergency services, and in 10 minutes, this house will be full of police, and then both you and I are finished." Maddie looked into his eyes and understood that he wasn't lying. She understood that she had just fallen into a world where even saving a human life had to be hidden, and she had exactly 2 choices: stand up, walk away, and leave him there, or do the thing she was no longer allowed to name. She chose the second. "Tell Toby to bring the large medical kit up here now," she said. Her voice changed, no longer trembling, but carrying that strange calm of someone who had just found a language she thought she had forgotten. When the kit arrived, her hands moved fast and steady, as if the abandoned years had never happened. She cleaned the wound with saline, pressed gauze against it to stop the bleeding, applied pressure exactly where it needed to be applied, and when she determined that the tear was long but hadn't reached any organs, she threaded the needle and stitched him up one careful suture at a time, her hands never faltering even though sweat had broken across her forehead. Salem watched her in silence the entire time, and for the first time, there was no contempt in his eyes. In its place was a confused scrutiny, as if he were trying to reconcile the clumsy woman he thought he had hired with the hands now sewing his body back together with the calm precision of a battlefield doctor. "You're not a maid," he said quietly, almost to himself. Maddie tied off the final stitch, wiped her hands, and only replied, "Tonight, sir. You should be grateful I'm not just a maid." Then she told him to lie still, not to twist his body, and to take antibiotics in the morning, giving orders to the most feared man in Southside Chicago, as if he were nothing more than an ordinary, stubborn patient, and strangely enough, he obeyed. If Maddie thought stitching his body back together in the middle of the night would buy her even a little mercy, she was wrong, because in the days that followed, Salem seemed determined to prove the opposite, as if that very moment of vulnerability had made him need to push her farther away in order to reclaim control. The first morning, just after she had finished changing his bandage, he ordered her to scrub the entire marble floor of the 3rd floor by hand, without using a machine, and to have it finished before lunch, an order so unreasonable that Greta, when she heard about it, brought her knife down hard on the cutting board. But Maddie only rolled up her sleeves, took a rag and a bucket, and scrubbed while humming under her breath. And when Salem walked past to inspect her work, his face cold and waiting for a complaint, she looked up and said his floor was so clean she could see his scowl reflected in it. And that sir ought to smile more often so all that marble wouldn't go to waste. He didn't answer, but he also couldn't find a single flaw to criticize, and that in itself was a small victory. The second test came the following afternoon, when he demanded that she rearrange the entire wine cabinet, according to an order he deliberately refused to explain, offering only a single sentence that if she was smart enough, she would figure it out on her own. A trap laid so she would either have to ask and reveal her incompetence, or do it wrong and be reprimanded. Maddie didn't ask. She stood in silence, looking at the rows of bottles for a while, then arranged them by vintage from oldest to newest, And when he walked in, with his face already prepared for criticism, she spoke first, and said she guessed a man who liked controlling everything the way he did would want to see time passing in one straight line, and if she'd guessed wrong, he could rearrange it himself, since she was being paid by the hour anyway. The corner of his mouth twitched, and this time she was almost certain it was something he was trying to swallow before it became a laugh. By the third test, Greta herself warned her that he was hosting several business associates that evening, and that whenever guests of that kind came, the servers were watched down to the smallest detail. One tiny mistake was enough to send the person before her packing, so she had better be careful with the tray, careful with her mouth, and most of all, not drop anything. Maddie carried the tray of drinks among men in expensive suits whose eyes were sharp as knives, keeping her back straight and her hands steady. And when one of them deliberately stuck out his foot to see whether she would trip, she stepped over it cleanly, as if she had seen it from far away, set the glass down in front of him without spilling a drop, and said softly, just loud enough for him to hear, that next time he should keep his foot where it belonged, because she served drinks, not childish games. The man froze, while Salem, watching from the head of the room, showed something close to satisfaction for the first time in many months. Late that night, after all the guests had gone and the mansion had fallen back into its familiar silence, Maddie sat in the kitchen with Greta, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, and the older woman looked at her for a long while before saying that she had seen 9 people come and go. Some had cried, some had cursed, some had quietly vanished in the night, but not one of them had ever dared answer him the way Maddie did, and still remained whole. Maddie shrugged and said maybe it was because the others still had something left to lose, while she had already lost almost everything. And it was hard to scare someone who was used to living at the bottom. Greta didn't laugh at that joke. She only reached out and took Maddie's hand, the hand still rough with calluses and smelling faintly of soap, and said that if she needed someone in this house to stand on her side, she already had one. And for the first time since stepping through the Falcone gates, Maddie felt her throat tighten, not from fear, but from a warmth she hadn't been given in a very long time. A few days later, on a rainy afternoon while Salem was away handling business at the docks, Frank came to find Maddie in the small study on the first floor, where he often sat alone with his stacks of ledgers, and told her to close the door, a request that made her stomach tighten, because in this house, closed doors rarely promised anything good. He sat there for a while, turning the old ring on his finger, then asked whether she had ever wondered why a cleaning job paid 3 or 4 times the normal wage, and when she answered that she had tried not to think about it because she was afraid that if she did, she wouldn't have dared to take it. He nodded as though that was exactly the answer he had expected. Not because the work is hard, he said quietly, but because the person doing it has to be a rare kind of person. Someone who knows no one in this world, owes no one anything, carries no name that anyone out there could recognize. Someone clean enough that no one could use them to plant a spy inside this house. Maddie frowned and asked what anyone would be planted here for, and Frank was silent for a long while, his eyes settling on the window where rain was sliding down the glass. Then he spoke in the voice of a man who had grown weary from carrying a secret for too long, saying that in this house, in this organization, there was someone who wasn't what they pretended to be, someone who had lived among them for years, eaten at the same table, laughed at the same stories, and all that time had been quietly selling off piece by piece of everything they heard. And the most frightening thing wasn't the betrayal, but the fact that no one knew where it was coming from. He told her, without going into detail, that certain jobs had fallen apart at the very last minute when they shouldn't have been able to, that trusted men had vanished on nights when only a few people knew where they would be, and each time, the circle of those who could be trusted had shrunk a little more, until it had become so small there was almost no one left. "I've served this family for more than 30 years, Frank said. I carried young Master Salem in my arms before he even knew how to walk. I saw this house when there was still laughter in it, and I saw that laughter fade until only suspicion was left. And now I'm an old man who can no longer trust a single face around me, not even the faces I love." Maddie sat in silence, feeling the whole room seem to sink beneath the weight of what he had just said. Then she asked why he was telling this to her, someone who had been there less than 2 weeks, and Frank looked at her with eyes red from lack of sleep, and answered that it was precisely because she was new, precisely because she didn't belong here, that she was the only person he dared to trust, a person who hadn't yet had time to be corrupted by this world. He needed at least one pair of eyes in this house to see things the way an outsider would, because those inside it had been staring at one another for so long they could no longer see anything at all. He didn't ask her to do anything specific. He didn't tell her to watch anyone. He only told her to pay attention, to remember, and if she noticed anything unusual, to tell him before she told anyone else. Maddie left the study with the feeling that the ground beneath her feet had just tilted, because she had come here thinking she was only a well-paid maid. And now she understood that Frank had chosen her, not in spite of her being an outsider, but because she was one. And the true role she had accidentally stepped into was heavier than any stretch of floor she had ever scrubbed. A role she had never asked for, and wasn't sure she wanted to accept. Frank's warning made Maddie begin looking at everything in the mansion with different eyes. And perhaps because of that, later that evening, when she carried a tray of coffee down to the ground floor later than usual, she accidentally arrived at exactly the wrong moment. The door to the large study was slightly open, and through the narrow gap she saw Salem standing in the middle of the room, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face so still it was chilling, while a younger man was forced to his knees on the floor by two large men, trembling as he begged for mercy. Maddie knew she should turn away. Every cell in her body ordered her to step back, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor, and she stood there listening as Salem spoke in a quiet voice, more frightening than any shout, saying he had given this man every chance, had treated him like family, and in return, the man had leaked information about a shipment to someone else for a handful of loose change. The man wept, swearing he had been forced, that he had a family, and for one moment Maddie thought she was about to witness the most terrible thing imaginable. But Salem didn't lay a hand on him. He only bent down and said something into the man's ear too softly for her to hear. And though not a single drop of blood was spilled, the way the man's whole body collapsed under absolute terror sent a colder chill down Maddie's spine than any blow could have, because she understood that in Salem's world there were things more frightening than death, and he held all of them in his hands. When the two men dragged the man out through the back door, Salem looked up and caught sight of her standing there with the coffee tray trembling in her hands, and for one long second, they only stared at each other. She thought he would rage, that he would send her away for seeing something she wasn't supposed to see, but he only said in a weary voice that now she had seen who he truly was, and she could run like the others if she wanted to. No one would blame her. Maddie set the tray on the table, her hands still shaking, but she didn't run. She looked straight at him and asked what he was going to do to the man. And when Salem answered that it wasn't her business, she said maybe it wasn't, but she still wanted to know whether there was anything left in the man standing here of the person who had let her stitch his wound without killing her to keep her quiet, or whether that part had died too, along with whatever had turned him into this. The question hung suspended in the air, and for the first time, Maddie saw a crack pass across his stone face, something almost like pain, before he turned away and said quietly that she didn't understand this world. Here, kindness was a deadly luxury. Whoever went soft died first. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and a man stepped in, a little over 40, neatly dressed, with a calm manner and a courteous smile, someone Maddie had glimpsed a few times before but had never spoken to. Quinn Vance walked to Salem's side with the proper amount of concern, asked whether everything was settled, said he had just heard the news and had come at once, that he had always felt something wasn't right about that traitor, and regretted not warning him sooner. He placed a hand on Salem's shoulder, with the gesture of an old friend, reassuring him that he would take care of the rest, that Salem should rest because his wound still hadn't healed, and every word he spoke was right, was considerate, and arrived at exactly the moment it was most needed. Maddie watched him from the corner of the room, and though there was no specific reason for it, though the man hadn't done anything wrong, she still felt something vague stir inside her, that uneasy feeling one gets when something looks too perfect, too neatly fitted, too perfectly timed. But then she pushed it aside, telling herself that perhaps after what Frank had told her, she had begun suspecting even the shadows. Nearly a week after that night in the study, Salem returned to the mansion at the gray edge of dawn, with his body leaning sharply to one side, and Maddie, who had grown used to waking early, was the first to see him stagger into the foyer, one hand gripping the stair rail, his face deathly pale beneath the dim gray light of morning. The old stitches along his ribs had torn open, not from simple overexertion, but from some new impact he refused to explain. And this time, the blood didn't seep out slowly the way it had on that first night. It had spread in a wide, dark stain across the fabric, making her understand at once that things were far worse than before. She frantically tried to contact the family's private doctor, but the mansion's communication lines had been mysteriously cut, and all cellular signals were dead, making Maddie realize with a sinking heart that once again, in this vast house, she was the only one left who could save him. She helped him into the room, lowered him onto the edge of the bed, and as she began peeling the blood-soaked shirt from his body, her fingers worked with the concentration of someone trying to keep her mind clear, while something inside her chest had begun to tilt unsteadily. She cleaned the skin around the wound, repeated each step, and this time, once the tear had been treated, she began wrapping a long strip of cloth around his upper body, passing it behind his back and then around to the front again, each turn of the bandage drawing her closer, close enough to hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing, close enough to see the old scars crossing his body like a map of a life whose outer edges she had only just begun to touch. He stayed silent the entire time, but it wasn't his usual cold silence. It was another kind of tension altogether, and when she brought the final strip of bandage around and lifted her head to tie it off, she realized her face was only an inch or two from his, and they both stayed still in that moment longer than ordinary sense should have allowed. Then suddenly, before she could step back, he rose despite the pain, one hand catching her wrist as he turned, pressing her back against the cold wall behind her, not roughly enough to hurt her, but firmly enough that she couldn't move, and his face lowered close to hers, his gray eyes dark now as they stared directly into her own without blinking. Maddie didn't cry out. She didn't struggle. Her heart was pounding hard, but she kept her gaze locked on his, and in that breathless closeness, she could feel the hot, uneven rush of his breath against her skin. He could see the way his jaw tightened, as if he were wrestling with something inside himself more violent than the pain in his side. "What are you?" he said quietly, his voice gone hoarse. "Why don't you run like all the others? Don't you understand? Aren't you afraid?" "I am," she answered, her voice just as soft but not trembling. "I'm afraid, but I'm too tired of running." Something flickered in his eyes, and for one brief second, the distance between them seemed as if it might close completely, a second in which they both knew the line between threat and something entirely different had grown so thin it was almost gone. But then he stepped back, releasing her wrist as if he had touched fire, turned away a few steps, and stood there with his shoulders trembling from the effort to hold himself in check. "Don't come near me," he said, and this time his voice dropped into a real warning, one that sounded more like pleading than command. "Everyone who comes near me dies. You don't understand that. Everyone I've ever allowed close has paid for it with their life. So if you're smart, keep your distance. Do your work. Leave when the week is over. And never let me see you looking at me the way you're looking at me now." Maddie stood with her back against the wall, her heart still beating wildly, staring at the bandaged back of the man who had just pushed her away with the very fear that he might hurt her, and she understood with a clarity that frightened even her that she had already crossed too far beyond the safe line to turn back now. Maddie couldn't sleep that night, partly because his ribs still worried her, partly because the moment against the wall kept coming back in her mind like a faint burn that refused to fade. So when the cry echoed from the end of the hall in the deepest part of the night, she was already awake and sat up almost at once. It wasn't the sound of something falling the way it had been that first night, but the sound of a person, a call caught in the throat, then a name spoken over and over again. "Leo, Leo," his voice hoarse and distorted by a pain she had never heard in his waking voice. She ran down the dark hallway without bothering to put on another layer, and pushed open his door to find Salem thrashing in the sheets, drenched in sweat, both hands striking blindly through the air as if he were trying to push something away or hold something back, something that existed only behind his clenched, shut eyes. In the dim darkness, with only a little moonlight slipping through the gap in the curtains, the face of the most powerful man in Southside Chicago looked so young and broken that Maddie felt a sharp ache in her chest, because this was no longer the crime lord who could silence grown men. This was only a human being sinking into a private hell no one else could reach. She sat down on the edge of the bed, at first intending to shake him awake, but old experience warned her that waking someone trapped in panic too suddenly would only make them fight harder, so she lowered her voice until it was deep and steady, calling his name again and again. "Salem, Salem, it's me. You're home. There's no one here but me." He startled awake and shot upright with a ragged gasp, his eyes wide open but not truly seeing anything yet, his chest rising and falling far too fast, both trembling hands clutching the blanket, and Maddie recognized at once that he was breathing so hard he was close to passing out, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone whose body had forgotten how to calm itself down. She didn't touch him right away. She only held out her hand where he could see it, then spoke in the same voice she had once used with panicked patients during long nights on duty. "Look at me. Can you hear my voice? Now you do exactly what I do. Breathe in slowly through your nose. Count to 4. Hold it. Then breathe out long and slow." He shook his head, saying he couldn't, that he couldn't breathe, that his chest felt as if someone were crushing it shut, and she answered that he could. He could do it. Just look at her and follow her. Breathe. And she placed her own hand against her chest, letting it rise and fall with each breath so he would have something to copy, then repeated the words softly. Breathe. Inhale. Hold. Exhale, like a spell she was sending into the dark. It took a long while, so long she lost count of how many breaths had passed. But little by little, his frantic breathing began to slow. His chest stopped jerking, and the fingers gripping the blanket slowly loosened. When the panic finally withdrew, he sat there in the darkness, silent and exhausted, his hair damp with sweat. And for the first time since she had stepped into this house, he didn't try to pretend he was strong. He didn't try to rebuild the wall. He only sat there with the raw, bare vulnerability of a man who had just been struck down by his own dream. She didn't ask who Leo was, though the name still hung in the air between them like a ghost, unwilling to leave. She only sat there beside him in silence, close enough for him to know he wasn't alone, but not so close that it forced him to raise his defenses again. After a long while, in a voice so hoarse it was almost soundless, he said thank you. Just one word. But from the mouth of this man, it weighed more than 1,000. Maddie only nodded, drew the blanket back up over him as gently as if she were covering a child, and said softly, "I'll sit here until you fall asleep again. Just close your eyes. Nothing can touch you tonight." He didn't fall back asleep right away, and Maddie didn't leave either. The two of them simply sat there in the dark room, and perhaps it was the darkness that made speaking easier, because when people couldn't clearly see each other's faces, the things buried the longest sometimes dared to rise to the surface. "Leo was my younger brother," he said, his voice hoarse and distant, as if echoing back from somewhere far away. 6 years younger than me. He was the only person in this world I truly loved. He told her, little by little, about a brother who laughed often, a boy who had always believed in the good in people, even after growing up among men who had almost none left in them. The younger brother Salem had promised his mother before she died that he would protect at any cost. 7 years earlier, on a winter night, there had been an arranged meeting, a deal that only a few people should have known about, and Leo, who had never wanted anything to do with his brother's business, but had still gone along that night because he believed that if Salem was beside him nothing could happen, had walked straight into a trap that someone sitting close enough to know every detail, had laid in advance. Salem stopped for a long time at that part, and in the darkness Maddie could hear even the dry swallow in his throat. Then he went on, saying he had arrived only a few minutes too late, just a few minutes. And those few minutes were the entire distance between saving his brother and holding him in his arms as he took his final breath, Leo's blood soaking through Salem's shirt. And the last thing his brother did was hold his hand and tell him it was all right, that it wasn't his fault, a forgiveness Salem had never been able to give himself. Since that night, he said, I buried the part of me still capable of love with him, because I understood one thing. Whenever I let someone close, whenever I allowed myself to care about anyone, I gave this world something it could take from me. So I'd rather be a man everyone fears than a man anyone can wound through the people he loves. Maddie sat listening, not interrupting, not rushing to comfort him with hollow words, because she understood there were kinds of pain that comfort only cheapened. And when he finally fell silent, she said softly that she didn't know what it felt like to lose a brother that way, but she did know what it felt like to arrive a few minutes too late. Then she told him, for the first time telling anyone the whole of it, about the mother who had raised her and her younger brother alone. The woman who had worked 2 shifts a day so Maddie could get into nursing school, about that final year when her mother fell ill and Maddie had abandoned everything to come home and care for her, pushing the wheelchair, feeding her 1 spoonful of porridge at a time, learning to inject pain medicine with her own trembling hands. She told him about those last nights in the hospital, about the medical degree she was so close to finishing. A brilliant future in surgery, traded away for endless medical bills, and the crushing weight of knowing that all her advanced knowledge still couldn't keep the person she loved alive. 2 wounds, one belonging to a man who had lost his brother to violence, the other to a woman who had lost her mother to illness and poverty, lay exposed between them in the darkness of the room, different in shape, but the same at the core, the helplessness of a person who had done everything and still hadn't done enough. "I think," Maddie said quietly, "maybe we didn't really bury the part of us that knows how to love. Maybe we only hid it because we were afraid. Because loving someone means giving the world a way to hurt you, but hiding it doesn't make it die. It just lies there and waits." Salem turned to look at her in the darkness, and though she couldn't clearly see his eyes, she could feel that something between them had changed forever, that a door both of them had kept locked for a very long time had just opened by the smallest crack. That narrow crack didn't swing open into a great door in a single night, because people who had locked their hearts away for too long didn't change that way. But in the days that followed, Maddie began to notice changes so small they could have been missed if she hadn't been paying attention. Salem began coming down to the kitchen in the mornings instead of having food brought up to his room, at first only leaning against the doorway in silence with his coffee, while she and Greta talked. Then little by little sitting down at the table, and though he rarely said much, his presence no longer carried the usual threatening coldness. It became something almost like a search for company. One morning, he pushed a cup of coffee toward her, coffee he had made himself, clumsy and a little too strong, then said curtly that she tended to forget breakfast when she was taking care of other people, a small, ordinary remark that left Maddie still for a moment, because it meant he had noticed, that he had watched her long enough to know that habit. She accepted the cup, hid her smile behind the rim, and said the coffee was terrible, but she was touched, that Sir ought to stick with frightening people, because making coffee clearly wasn't his talent, and this time, for the first time, he truly laughed, a quiet, brief sound, but real, making the whole kitchen seem to brighten for a moment. On another afternoon, he led her out onto the wide balcony overlooking the city, where the wind lifted the loose strands of her hair, and he stood there for a long while in silence, before saying something he had perhaps never spoken aloud to anyone. "I've been thinking about leaving all of this behind," he said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I built this empire on blood and fear. I thought it was the only way not to be swallowed whole. But lately I keep wondering what Leo would think if he were alive to see me now, and I don't like the answer." Maddie turned to look at him, not rushing into joy, because she was wise enough to know a person couldn't untangle an entire life with one sentence on a balcony, and she could see the struggle in him clearly, the way one part of him longed to get out while another part remained terrified that letting go would mean betraying everything he had sacrificed to gain. "I'm not telling you what to do," she said softly, "but I think a person only begins wanting to leave the darkness when some little light has already started burning inside them again. And the fact that you're standing here saying this to me is already so much more than the man who stood with his back to the window on the day I first arrived." He looked at her, and in that golden afternoon light, his face softened in a way she had never seen before. It was no longer the stone face of a crime lord, but the face of a man allowing himself to hope for the first time in 7 years. The distance between them on the balcony shortened naturally, not with a tortured press against the wall like before, but with a quiet and gentle pull. And when he reached out to brush a wind-blown strand of hair from her face and tuck it behind her ear, the gesture was so awkward it almost trembled, as if the hand that was used to cruel things was having to learn all over again how to touch something delicate without breaking it. Maddie didn't step back. She let that hand touch her, and in the hushed moment above the city spread far below, they both knew they were standing at the edge of something both beautiful and dangerous, something neither of them had dared believe for far too long that they still deserved to have. The tender moment on the balcony hadn't even had time to settle when Maddie's phone began to vibrate with an unfamiliar number, and the voice on the other end made her blood turn cold, because it was Colt, her younger brother whom she had scraped and saved every penny to support through school, and his voice was shaking with a panic she had never heard from him before. He told her, stumbling and breaking off between words, that he had been working evenings as a delivery driver to help ease her burden, that a roommate had introduced him to a job that paid generously in cash, just carrying a few packages from one place to another without asking questions. And Colt, that decent, trusting boy who always believed the best of people, had accepted without ever knowing what he was carrying or who he was carrying it for. Tonight he had finally realized those packages weren't ordinary at all. And worse, the people who had hired him had started hinting that now he knew too much, that he belonged to them now. And Colt was hiding in the bathroom of a gas station, too frightened to go back to his dorm. calling the only person he had always trusted in this life. Maddie listened with her hands and feet turning ice cold, forcing her voice to stay calm so she could reassure him, telling him to stay right where he was, lock the door, don't talk to anyone, she would find a way. But when she ended the call, her whole body began to tremble, because she understood better than anyone how dangerous the world her brother had accidentally stepped into truly was. The very world she was now living in the heart of. Salem, standing nearby, had heard enough to understand, and when she turned toward him with tears shining in her eyes, meaning to beg but not knowing where to begin, he stepped closer and did something that left her stunned. He set both hands on her shoulders, looked straight into her eyes, and said in a voice as solid as stone that her brother was going to be all right. He promised her. Just give him the address of that gas station. Maddie hesitated, because asking for help from a man like Salem meant owing a debt in a world where every debt came with a price, and she stammered that she couldn't drag him into her family's trouble, that this was her problem, but he cut her off with a sentence that made her heart clench, saying it had been too long since he had used his power for anything except making people afraid, so let him use it once to keep someone safe. Let him do the thing he hadn't been able to do for Leo. In those words, Maddie heard both a confession and an act of atonement, understood that saving Colt wasn't only about helping her, but also about giving Salem one chance to do over the thing he had arrived a few minutes too late to do 7 years ago, and she nodded, giving him the address with both hands still shaking. He moved quickly and decisively, making several phone calls to have his men pick Colt up and move him to a discreet location. The operation went smoothly, and Salem's most trusted men successfully escorted Colt to a highly secured, hidden safe house far from the city center. Salem told Maddie that Colt was completely secure, assuring her that her brother was now under the absolute protection of the Falcone house, giving them both a momentary sense of relief. When Salem passed along the update that the perimeter was secure, Maddie broke down, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks, and she turned to him with a heart too full for words. All she could do was look at him with gratitude filling her eyes, believing the storm had finally passed. Completely unaware of the trap already closing around them, he looked back at her and said softly that she didn't need to thank him, that she was the one teaching him what it felt like to protect someone again. And in that moment, Maddie understood that his promise to change was no longer just words spoken on a balcony. It had just been tested by real action, and it had held. The very act of Salem stepping in to save Colt, mobilizing his men and exposing a few lines of communication, created exactly the opening Quinn Vance had been waiting for, because only a few days later, he sought Salem out in private, with the heavy expression of a man forced to say something he didn't want to say. He closed the study door, placed several sheets of paper on the desk, then began in a voice full of regret, saying he had hesitated for a long time before coming, that he had prayed he was wrong, but with things as they were now, remaining silent would be a betrayal of the organization. He repeated what everyone knew but no one dared say outright, that for many years there had been someone leaking information from the inside, that the ruined operations, the vanished men, all of it pointed to a snake inside the house. And then he released the perfectly calculated sentence, asking whether it wasn't strange that everything had grown worse from the moment that girl appeared. He laid out the evidence, not crudely, but with skill, a piece of information showing that someone inside the mansion had contacted an unfamiliar number on certain sensitive nights. The fact that Maddie had appeared at the mansion, at the very moment everything began to fall into chaos. The medical background she had kept hidden and revealed only when she needed access to Salem at his weakest, and even the matter of her brother becoming entangled with contraband, which, according to Quinn, might not have been accidental at all, but a staged performance meant to draw Salem into the open. Piece by piece, none of it was certain proof, yet all of it together formed a vicious picture that fit so neatly it became difficult to deny, and Quinn concluded, in a voice soft as velvet, that he wasn't accusing anyone. He only thought a man in Salem's position couldn't afford to let his heart cloud his reason right now, because people had already died from trusting the wrong person. The name went unspoken, but it hung in the room. And while Salem's mind was clouded with growing suspicion toward Maddie, Quinn secretly initiated the next phase of his plan, moving to breach the safe house where Colt was being kept. He no longer came down to the kitchen in the mornings, no longer looked into her eyes when she changed his bandage, answered her with short, cold sentences like he had in the beginning, and when she asked whether something was wrong, he only told her to do her work and stop asking so many questions, the very sentence Frank had warned her about from the first day. That coldness hurt Maddie more than being pressed against the wall, or any threat ever had, because it came right after the warmest days, right after the balcony and the clumsy cup of coffee and the promise to save her brother, and it was precisely that cruel contrast that made her feel as if she had fallen from a great height. She didn't understand what she had done wrong, lying awake through entire nights, going back over every word and every gesture, wondering whether she had revealed something that had made him turn away, never knowing that an invisible hand was carefully planting the most poisonous seed of suspicion in his heart. One evening, she found him standing alone in the hallway, and she walked up to him and asked directly that if she had done something to make him angry, then he should say it to her face, because she could bear the truth, but she couldn't bear being pushed away in silence like this. Salem looked at her for a very long time, and in his eyes there was a fierce struggle between the man who had begun to trust her and the man who had survived the past 7 years on suspicion alone, between the heart that had just started to open and the voice in his head reminding him that the last time he had let someone close, that person had died. In the end, he only said quietly that he didn't know who she was anymore, a half-finished sentence filled with hurt, then turned away and left her standing there in the cold hallway. And Maddie, for the first time since coming to this place, felt a loneliness even more freezing than the loneliness that had brought her here. It was Frank who accidentally turned everything upside down, because the old butler, after many years of quietly taking notes and watching with a suspicion that never went out, had noticed one detail that didn't fit and brought it to Maddie instead of Salem, because he no longer dared to trust that his young master, in his current state of doubt, would listen to him. He showed her an old ledger that recorded duty schedules and internal calls, then pointed to that winter night 7 years earlier, the night Leo died, and said that all these years, one thing had haunted him, that only a handful of people had known the location of that fatal meeting, and he had quietly ruled them out one by one until only one name remained, a name he hadn't dared to believe, a name that had always stood too close, always appeared at the right moment, always been the one to bring bad news just after it happened. Maddie looked at the numbers, the dates, and matched them with the vague feeling she had had from the very first time she saw Quinn place his hand on Salem's shoulder. That feeling of something too perfect, too neatly fitted, too precisely timed, and suddenly all the scattered pieces locked together into a picture that chilled her to the bone. The informer Frank had spoken of for years, the one who had set the trap that killed Leo, and the one who had just whispered in Salem's ear to push her away, were all the same person. The two of them hurried to secure the evidence, and through Frank's deep knowledge of the mansion's network, they managed to intercept Quinn's private, encrypted files, finding data showing that he had been secretly transferring the organization's assets and connections into his own name, little by little. A list of people loyal to Salem marked for removal, and worst of all, an old communication with the rival gang from 7 years before. Proof that the night Leo died hadn't been an accident of fate, but an assassination Quinn had arranged to eliminate the brother Salem loved, the first step in a long plan to break Salem down and gradually take everything. Just then, the door flew open, and Salem stood there. He had been looking for Maddie and had heard the last part, his eyes fixed on the papers in her hands, and Maddie saw his face pass through every shade of feeling in a few short seconds, from disbelief to horror, and then to an icy rage as the truth about his brother's death finally came into the light. He took the old communication, his hand trembling, and read it again and again as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into another story. But they didn't, and when he lifted his eyes to Maddie, beyond the anger in them was another deeper pain. The pain of a man who had just realized he had almost pushed away the only person who had been sincere with him in order to protect the very man who had destroyed his life. "I suspected you," he said, his voice breaking. "I let him whisper in my ear, and I turned my back on you, while all that time the man I called my brother, the man I trusted most, was the one who killed Leo." Maddie stepped toward him, and though the wound from his coldness over the past few days was still there inside her, she wasn't the kind of person who could cling to resentment in a moment of danger. She only said that now wasn't the time for him to blame himself, because if Quinn had been plotting for that long, and had gone this far, he wouldn't stop. He would strike soon, and they needed to prepare before he realized he had been exposed. Salem took her hand, not to push her away this time, but to hold on, and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." And she answered that forgiveness could wait. Right now, he needed to be the man this entire organization still feared, because they were about to need him. But the moment she finished speaking, Salem's phone vibrated with a message, and when he looked down at the screen, his face went pale, because Quinn had just successfully completed his ambush and taken Colt from the safe house. The message contained only one photograph and one line of text, and the photograph left both Maddie and Salem frozen, because in it was Colt, her younger brother, sitting in a chair inside some warehouse, his hands tied, a streak of dried blood at the corner of his mouth, the boy's eyes wide with fear as he stared straight into the camera. The line beneath it was brief and cold, carrying Quinn's exact brand of deadly courtesy, saying that the safe place Salem thought he had hidden the boy in wasn't quite so safe after all, that Quinn had always known Salem's every move, because he was the one who had planned half of them for so many years, and that if Salem wanted the boy alive, he had exactly 24 hours to sign over the entire organization, its assets, its routes, and all control to Quinn, then disappear from Chicago forever. When Maddie finished reading, her knees gave way, and the whole world seemed to collapse beneath her feet, because her worst fear had just become real. The brother she had sacrificed everything to protect was now in the hands of the cruelest man alive, simply because he had a sister who had stumbled into this world, and she broke into sobs, stammering that it was all her fault, that if only she had never come here, if only she hadn't dragged Colt into it. Salem knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders, and told her no, this wasn't her fault. This was something Quinn had been planning for a long time, and he would have found a way with or without her. But even as he spoke those words, his voice was heavy, because he understood better than anyone that the very world he had built had turned an innocent, trusting young man into a pawn. That night was a terrible long night, and in the study where everything had first begun, the two of them faced a choice with no clean way out. Maddie begged him to just give everything to Quinn, saying she didn't need an empire, didn't need money, she only needed her brother alive, that no fortune was worth a human life, and she clutched his shirt, pleading with all the desperation of a sister. But Salem, though his heart broke at the sight of her like that, knew a brutal truth she didn't know, that Quinn wasn't the kind of man who kept his word, that someone who had murdered an innocent younger brother 7 years earlier to clear a path would never leave a witness like Colt alive after getting what he wanted, that handing over the organization wouldn't save Colt, it would only give Quinn both the hostage and the power, and afterward, he would erase everyone who could threaten him, including her, including the boy. He tried to explain that to her in the gentlest voice he could manage, saying that if he did what Quinn demanded, he would be signing a death warrant for all three of them, not saving Colt, and Maddie, through her tears, slowly began to understand that cold logic, to understand that they were trapped between two roads, and both led to the edge of an abyss. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice hoarse, and Salem was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the photograph of her younger brother, as if he were seeing Leo in it. Then he said softly that there was one way, but it was dangerous, and it required him to do the very thing he had done all his life, deceive a man who believed he was holding every card, only this time he wouldn't do it the old way. He wouldn't trade Colt's life for more blood. He would find a way to bring the boy out, and still end Quinn once and for all. Maddie looked at him and saw in his eyes the familiar steel of the crime lord, but this time it served a different purpose entirely, and she wiped her tears, nodded, and placed her trust and her brother's life in the hands of the man she had been warned only a few weeks earlier, never to look directly in the eye. Salem agreed to the meeting place, Quinn demanded, an abandoned warehouse by the river at midnight. But he didn't go empty-handed, and he didn't go there to surrender. He brought a plan, a stack of papers pretending to be transfer documents, and several of the most loyal people Frank had confirmed were clean, positioning them quietly around the area. Maddie insisted on going with him even though he tried to stop her, because she said that if anything happened to Colt, she wouldn't care about living anyway, and besides, if the boy was hurt, she was the only one who could save him on the spot, an argument even Salem couldn't refute. Inside the cold warehouse, only a few dim yellow lights threw long shadows across the rusted metal walls, and Quinn stood there with his usual calm smile, Colt tied to a chair behind him, guarded by 2 men, the boy's face lighting with a desperate flicker of hope when he saw his sister step inside. Quinn said he knew Salem too well to believe he would obediently give up everything. But he also knew everyone had a weakness, and the weakness of a man who had spent his whole life loving no one had turned out to be loving the wrong little maid and her useless younger brother. Salem placed the stack of papers on a crate, his voice ice cold as he proposed the trade. the boy in exchange for the documents. But when Quinn signaled for one of his men to check them, he realized the papers were fake, and in the instant he understood he had been deceived, everything erupted at once. Quinn drew his gun. Salem's men rushed in from the hidden corners. Gunfire cracked harshly against the metal walls, and in that chaos, Salem charged straight toward Colt, knocked down the guard, tore at the ropes binding the boy, and shoved him down behind a pile of crates. But at the exact moment, he turned to shield Colt. Quinn, crazed by the collapse of a lifetime's plan, aimed at him and pulled the trigger, and Maddie heard that shot as if she were hearing her own heart break when she saw Salem stagger and then fall, one hand clutching his chest where blood was pouring out. Salem's men quickly overpowered Quinn, forcing him down onto the floor while he kept screaming venomous words. But Maddie could no longer hear anything. She had already thrown herself down beside Salem, both hands pressing hard against the bleeding wound in his chest. Hot blood surging through her fingers just as it had on that first night when she stitched him together, only this time it was far too close to his heart. He looked up at her, his lips pale as he tried to form a smile, and whispered that Colt was safe now, wasn't he? And she sobbed while snapping at him not to talk, not to dare leave her. Did he hear her? Save his strength? And she drove her whole body weight down onto the wound to slow the bleeding, shouting for someone to call an ambulance immediately no matter the consequences. He began to gasp, the shallow, frantic breathing of a man slipping away, his eyes growing unfocused as they tried to close. And Maddie recognized that terrifying moment, so she bent close, one hand still pressing the wound, the other cradling his face and forcing him to look into her eyes. This time, it wasn't him teaching her, and it wasn't her teaching him how to breathe through panic. It was her using that same anchor to pull him back from the edge, saying through her tears, "Look at me. Breathe. You've done this before. Breathe in with me. Hold it. Don't let go. Stay with me. Breathe. Salem, please." She repeated that word like a lifeline. Breathe. Breathe. Each time pouring into it more than her own life. And he, though he was sinking, still tried to cling to her voice the way she had once been his anchor in the night of terror, forcing each weak, shallow breath to follow the rhythm she counted. When the ambulance siren finally rose in the distance and tore through the night, Maddie was still kneeling there in a pool of blood, both hands numb from pressing for so long, her mouth still whispering for him to stay, and Colt crawled out from behind the crates and wrapped his arms around his sister, the two of them trembling beside the man who had spilled his own blood to buy the life of a boy, the way 7 years earlier he hadn't been able to save his own younger brother. Salem survived, though the bullet had passed so close to his heart that the emergency room doctors had to tell Maddie that if someone hadn't applied pressure properly in those first minutes, he never would have made it to the operating table. And during the days he lay in recovery, she almost never left the chair beside his bed, holding the hand that had once made an entire city tremble, now lying weak and still inside her own. When he was finally awake enough to speak, the first thing the two of them had to face wasn't their feelings, but the heavy question of Quinn, who was being held by Salem's men in a discreet location, and by every rule of the world Salem had once lived in. There was only one ending meant for a man who had killed his brother and kidnapped the person he loved: a bullet and a river. His men waited for the order, and everyone thought that order was obvious, the revenge Salem had waited 7 years to take. But when Maddie asked what he intended to do, she didn't beg, didn't preach. She only looked into his eyes and said he had bled so he wouldn't repeat the night Leo was lost. So did he truly want to end it all with the very thing that had caused it? Because if he killed Quinn, he would win by Quinn's rules. But if he wanted to truly get out, he had to win by different rules. Salem was silent for a very long time, staring up at the hospital room ceiling, and she saw on his face the final struggle between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Then he said quietly that all his life, he had believed the only justice in this world was the justice he carried out with his own hands, because he didn't trust the law, because he thought it was only for the weak. But killing Quinn wouldn't bring Leo back to him. It would only make him exactly what Quinn had been. That decision wasn't easy, and it demanded a price few men in his position would dare to pay, because to bring Quinn before real justice, Salem had to do the unthinkable for a crime lord. He contacted a federal prosecutor and offered to cooperate, handing over all the evidence he and Frank had gathered against Quinn, the financial documents, the old communication proving Leo's assassination, the takeover plan, everything necessary to prosecute Quinn on a series of federal felony charges. But he understood that testifying against Quinn also meant exposing his own empire, with Frank providing files that proved Salem had been actively trying to clean his operations, and that the darkest, bloodiest crimes were entirely masterminded by Quinn's rogue faction. The feds accepted a plea deal allowing Salem to dismantle his organization from within. When Frank heard the decision, he went still, then placed a hand on the shoulder of the young master he had once held as an infant, saying this was something his father had never been brave enough to do, and that perhaps, at last, Salem had found the only way Leo could rest in peace. When the federal agents arrived to take Quinn and the files, Quinn looked at Salem in disbelief, shouting that turning him over to the FBI meant destroying himself too, a crime lord becoming an informant, and Salem only looked back at him with a calmness he had never had before, answering that perhaps it did, but at least he would no longer be a man like him. Standing beside him, Maddie held his hand, understanding that she had just witnessed the hardest thing a person could do, not killing an enemy, but refusing to become one, not winning through violence, but breaking the cycle that had swallowed so many generations before him. And for the first time since the night Leo died, Salem's face no longer carried the burden of a man running from himself. The trial stretched on for many months, and the price Salem had to pay was not small. But when everything finally came to an end, Quinn received a long federal sentence for a whole series of charges, while Salem, because of his complete cooperation and his determination to start over, was given a chance to step into another life. He dismantled everything that had once lived in the shadows, sold off or shut down the operations that could never stand in the light, and kept only the legitimate real estate and transportation businesses, running them for the first time as an honest businessman rather than a crime lord hiding behind a clean front. Maddie, with his encouragement and support, finally returned to complete her medical qualifications, a path she had once abandoned in grief. And on the day she officially accepted her degree, standing in the lecture hall with Colt and Salem sitting below and applauding, she cried, not from sorrow, but because the dream she had thought was dead had finally come back to life. But they didn't stop there, because both of them understood that healing oneself without helping others heal left that healing incomplete. So with part of the fortune Salem had moved into the light, they opened a nonprofit community support center right in the South Side, a place that provided free medical care, psychological counseling, and programs for teenagers standing at the edge of the very world that had nearly swallowed Colt, so they could have another road instead of the one so many young people had taken and never returned from. The center grew, and one afternoon, a young man they had pulled out of trouble many months earlier came back, this time not to ask for help, but to ask to volunteer, saying he wanted to be the person who reached out a hand to another child the same way someone had once reached out a hand to him. And when Maddie watched him guiding a newly arrived boy, she understood that the cycle of violence Salem had been brave enough to break was now being replaced by another kind of circle, a circle of kindness passed from one person to another. On a summer night, the two of them stood on the rooftop, looking down at Chicago, glittering with lights, the very view from which a man had once turned his back to the window to make himself look frightening, but now he stood facing her, one hand still marked by the scar where the bullet had passed through, and said that she had entered his house as a maid the whole world had taught itself to look down on because of her appearance. And yet she had been the only one who saw the real person inside him and was brave enough not to run. Maddie smiled and answered that perhaps both of them had been judged wrongly. Him because of the frightening armor he had built around himself, and her because of the outer shell the world had assigned to her, and in the end, what saved them both wasn't strength or power, but the courage to be kind to each other in a world that kept saying kindness was weakness, when in truth, kindness was the bravest thing of all. Maddie and Salem's story leaves us with profound lessons, that we should never judge a person by their appearance, because a person's true worth lies in their heart and their actions, not in their body, status, or position, that goodness and kindness are not signs of weakness, but the greatest strength of all, powerful enough to soften even the souls that seem the most hardened, and that every person, no matter how deeply they may once have lost their way, always has the chance to choose to turn back, to break the dark cycles of the past, and to walk toward the light. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video so that together we can spread meaningful stories and so that every day you can hear more captivating and moving stories like this one. How do you feel about this story, and what does it make you think about in your own real life? Have you ever been misjudged by others because of your appearance? Or have you ever witnessed kindness change a person? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep in your heart, because we always hope to hear your stories and your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. I wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.